Welcome everyone to Epoch Philosophy, just in podcast form. Thank you to everyone who supports the channel, podcast, everything at large at Epoch Philosophy as a whole. Consider pledging a couple dollars a month to help keep this entire project alive and get access to some really cool perks like early access to videos, voting on future videos, Discord access, editing tutorials, and the like. Without further ado, let's get into it. All right, everyone, I am here with Nightmare Masterclass, with Dave from Nightmare Masterclass at that.
Hello.
Yeah, so he actually just made a video on the simulation theory and exploration that I actually really enjoyed. I think I've talked about it at large. As a content creator, I don't get to actually watch a lot of content. You would think, being a sort of professional YouTuber or whatever the fuck you want to call me or whatever, you would think that you'd be the most educated on other content circulating in your sort of field or area. But I'm not. I like do not watch any philosophy YouTube or like theory YouTube at all. But I did watch this video and I really enjoyed it, and I wanted to talk to him a little bit about it. So, Dave, how are you doing, dude?
I'm doing all right, man. Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, definitely. So we were actually talking at large about a lot of stuff. It wasn't necessarily to do with simulation theory, but or directly, but indirectly, we were talking about like sort of like the future of disaster and all that stuff. Whether we were talking about like education system at university going haywire, but really, like, I think that can kind of, going off that note, that can kind of lead us a little bit into some of the larger points of your video in simulation theory. I feel like what you did was you kind of picked apart the fetish of simulation theory, or the really weird, like, wonky, commodified fantasy of simulation theory, which I think is kind of I want to say purported by people like Elon Musk, right? I feel like you picked that apart, and you cited obviously the paper by Nick Bostrom, and it gets ignored, but you talked about like the limit of technological growth simply because humans or any other intergalactic species is likely going to like kill itself before it can even get to that kind of computational power. So I was wondering exactly, sort of directly from your video, what you thought on that.
Yeah, well, I would say we need to acknowledge that that's a possibility, that human extinction before a certain level of technological development is a distinct possibility. There are way too many variables, and I'm certainly not like enough of an authority to say exactly how likely it is. But this is the first premise in Bostrom's trilemma. He basically says, what if the simulation hypothesis, if it isn't true that we live in a simulation, the reason is either going to be because our civilization, no one in our civilization has enough interest to develop an advanced simulation, which is very unlikely, or we go extinct before we're able to. And that, I think, is, like I say in the video, it's one of the underestimated possibilities in Bostrom's trilemma. And he's pretty interested in civilizational collapse and human extinction and all this. So it's certainly not something that he underestimates. He basically says, of these three possibilities, I'm not in a position to comment on which is the most likely. He just says that one of them must be true. So that's an interesting setup for an argument.
No, that really is. I was thinking about it. I read a really interesting article that was like really in depth, probably the most in depth article. I can't even remember. It was a couple months ago where it was or what it was called. And it was kind of exploring the question of complete ecological disaster and what that means for the human race. And it was dismal, way more dismal in some ways than what you would imagine, because it got very specific, and then a little bit hopeful on some respects. But it kind of was trying to answer the question: is human civilization, like civilization, is it going to die from the climate from climate change? And the actual answer from that they got to was like, actually no. Like, humans are so adaptable that what will likely happen is we will find a way to adapt and survive, but the effects will be so detrimental, the human population will shrink immensely. And everything else will get destroyed. So like, animal species will just die. Like, everything is going to go absolutely haywire. And it's a lot that we are going to see like a massive graveyard on planet Earth. And the one thing that will likely survive, at least a larger mammal or species, is probably going to be humans. But it is going to take a toll on so much that when we address the question of climate change and disaster, it shouldn't necessarily be like, oh, we are all going to die, thus we should try to figure out this climate catastrophe. It should almost, I mean, you can say that, like, that's not necessarily bad messaging, because it gets the point across that shit can get real quick, but that, like, it's not necessarily us, it's everything else outside of us is why we need to really take the climate crisis seriously. And I found that to be a little bit interesting, but it's still Nick Bostrom's argument about like, having the computational power due to like disaster. Well, like, you can think in that kind of situation, man. I mean, like, we won't be progressing on computational power if we're like really trying to hone in on like even just surviving and adapting to such a wildly changing world, It'd
be a major setback, to say the least.
Yes.
And I think even that's kind of optimistic, because a lot of the estimates have been sort of conservative. And what we're seeing is that climate change is a lot worse than scientists have anticipated. So, if you look at a runaway greenhouse effect, there's not a single human being that can live on Venus. And that's what happens to a planet with a runaway greenhouse effect. It's not habitable. You can't live on Venus. So I guess I would say, I assume that human extinction is the trajectory that we're on, and I will be pleasantly surprised if that is not the case.
Yeah. So, I think that is certainly I think that's a very reasonable sort of conclusion to come to. I think after reading that article, I'm a little bit between the lines of like total extinction and like, but like the other thing though, at the same time, the other side of like, if we don't all go extinct, but we have massive population, like billions of deaths, in some ways, like, I'm not saying we might as well go extinct, but like almost, like, you know what I mean? Like, fuck me, man, that kind of insane disaster is just so incalculable, like in history, that I think that is at least probably the trajectory, right? Like, and like you said, like it's worse than what scientists have expected. You can imagine the effects are quicker than what they expected. Like, they're happening way sooner.
It seems to be the case. I'm not a climate scientist, but I keep seeing articles basically saying it's worse than we thought it was.
Same. And I don't know if you've noticed this, but within the past couple of years, it's always like there's a clock, right, that we have until like absolute, like, I think like absolute destitution, like a point where we can't return. And that clock seems to be like, there's a research article that comes out every other year, that every 6 months, that lowers the time that we have, like even further than before. They're like, oh, it's going to be 2030. And then the next one's like, oh, dude, no, it's 2026. And then the next one is like, no, actually we have till 2024. And that really does seem to be the case. And I think, someone like Zizek, he's one of the only like public intellectuals that is examining the sort of human, like the human dilemma of climate change that I noticed. I think we don't even realize that like the marking of the mid 21st century is going, like everything, it's going to be climate change. And we look at the 20th century, in most parts of the world, it was like World War II was the marking, like everything. Like I took an Eastern European film class, and I mean, Eastern Europe, it's all the after World War II. I mean, that's all media centered around. It was such a monumental catastrophe and event that like World War II had its marking everywhere. That will be nothing compared to what climate change does in the mid 21st century, right? Like it's going to be this, just everything's going to happen, like, and everything's going to have to revolve around it. And Slavoj Žižek's pretty much the only one right now, other than maybe some climate scientists outside of climate science, that's actually saying this. Like he's saying like right now, this COVID problem that we're having, which is a huge problem, it's nothing. Like this is a mere preschool playground sort of experiment to how we're going to deal with the climate crisis.
Right. And there are a number of distinctions to be made here. Yeah, obviously in terms of scale, that is one distinction. Another is that the pandemic has a natural origin. Climate change is a product of humans, right, largely. So it should be looked at in historical terms in the same way that we look at the Holocaust, in the same way that we look at Hiroshima. It's going to be an atrocity when millions of people in certain parts of the world die from heat exhaustion or dehydration. That should be viewed in, if we're looking at it in moral terms, it should be viewed in the same way that we view the Holocaust. And the people to blame are, the heads of these corporations, and the endless strive for profit, which, leads to CO2 emissions.
Right. Yeah. It's more of a, rather than something like of World War II wasn't merely a regional phenomenon, but the origins of World War II was sort of regional in the sense of like Europe and then parts of like Japan and stuff. I mean, climate change is just so global, like beyond like anything that we've ever seen. And yeah, going back directly to simulation theory, where the one promises of at least simulation being within a machine, right? Machine-based or computationally based simulation. Even with the development of quantum computers, which you brought up, and that's one of the newer approaches to computation that could facilitate something like a really interesting simulation. But like we don't even have how much are we going to be able to develop towards quantum computers when we're dealing with something as massive as climate change? Like I think after listening to your video and more, I'm actually like, when you look at the argument that Bostrom gives with we live in a simulation or we go extinct. I know there was three things that he gave. I forgot the third. But
the third is we almost certainly live in a simulation.
Oh, okay. So I'm looking at the paper abstract right now. Human species is likely to go extinct before reaching a post-human stage, which I think I'm really kind of starting. I feel a little bit more inclined to that, or at least technological growth. Yeah, technological growth will at least be extinct for a long period of time, and then it's going to be any human civilization is extremely unlikely. Number two, to run into a significant number of simulations of their evolutionary history. So essentially like no. And then three, we are almost certainly living in a computer simulations. And one of those will be true, which actually 2 out of 3 of those are very significant. The other one being that like no simulation. The 2 other though that is true, the statistical chance of that running, the extinction or simulation thing is going to be true, and that's really interesting.
Right. And I think the sort of what's the word I'm looking for? The rub to this is basically, I think Bostrom sets up his argument so that you're supposed to look at premise 2 and be like, oh, that's kind of silly. Because simulations are useful and they're entertaining. They can be entertaining, right? So humans do things for all sorts of reasons. If it's even remotely useful, it probably will be developed. And if it's even remotely entertaining, then, we'll do it for the sake of novelty. But that is all assuming that we don't destroy ourselves before we get to that point where it's technologically possible. And that's a big assumption.
Yeah, no, it really is. And I think even that premise is starting to grow, as we were speaking, more and more true as time goes on. I don't quite remember if this was in your video, but there was another angle of simulation theory that I found interesting that isn't necessarily a computational simulation, at least it's just a different angle to a simulation within a computer. And it's that when we become, or if we become, there's a big if here, obviously due to climate change, if we become intergalactic or spacefaring species, what will likely happen, the most efficient way to get to another planet or terraform another planet is to actually run like an AI sort of like almost species. At least down the pipeline of technological development, we'll run into like sort of weird quasi-slave-like entities that will do the work for us. They will terraform the planet. They will do these sort of things. And another theory of like simulation is that through the pipeline of like, sending a robot to terraform Mars, sending sending a almost half human robot to terraform Venus, and then like through there, we have this other being as technology evolves to terraform this planet, to the point we get to a point where there's going to be like another species we create in a sort of like slave-like endeavor. And that is another angle of simulation theory. I didn't know. Did you cover that, or have you even heard of that sort of idea of a sort of simulation-like theory?
Well, it sounds like what you're describing is humans get to the point where it's technologically possible to send really advanced drones across the galaxy, right, to make planets that are habitable for us. Which, I mean, in terms of human evolution and populating other planets, what would happen is inevitably a distinction between different types of humans. If you have a relatively insular group of people living on one planet, and then you have another group of people living on another planet, their evolutionary trajectory is going to reach a point where we could basically say they're different species, right?
Right. Yeah, you put that in way better words. I suck at talking, but yeah, no, that's right. That's kind of what I was talking about. I can't quite remember. Did you talk about that in your video?
I didn't really touch on that. That idea is I would put that in a different category. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't really put that under the header of simulation theory. I would put that under the header of, like post-human futures. Is it? It's fun to think about. I again lean towards human extinction as the most likely possibility. Simply because, I mean, I touch on this in the video, Fermi's Paradox. Are you familiar with that idea?
Yes.
Well, it does really raise the question, like, where is everybody?
Right.
Maybe it is just sort of a general thing that happens, that once a civilization gets to a certain point, they just destroy themselves, which is sort of like cosmically absurd, right?
Right. Yeah. And for everyone else listening to the podcast, do you want to kind of go into detail a little bit about some of the origins and what Fermi Paradox is and why it's actually important to this?
Sure. Yeah. So Enrico Fermi was a physicist. I believe he worked on the Manhattan Project. I can't quite remember, so apologies if that is not true. But at any rate, he was a physicist. The Fermi Paradox is basically it's based on a discussion he was having with some of his colleagues, where he was responding to the idea that alien life, alien civilization, given the size of the universe, is it's statistically improbable that humans are the only forms of life in the universe, which of course I would agree with.
Same.
But Fermi says, well, if that's true, where is everybody? So that is the simplest form of the Fermi paradox. He's basically asking, well, if it is statistically improbable that we're the only civilization to have developed, technology or whatever, where the heck is everybody? Why aren't we seeing a sky full of civilizations that have advanced to a certain point where we can detect them? We haven't seen any sign of alien life.
That's right. And you put it in really simple terms. That's right. And I actually do think he worked at Los Alamos as well. That's that's right. It's I actually think the Fermi paradox is extremely telling in a very philosophical and theoretical sense. That is a very, when you think about some of the damning questions or almost paradoxes in general. That's one of the biggest ones, because statistically speaking, there should be fucking aliens everywhere, right? And I think it sort of, there's a lot of conclusions from there, or really interesting observations or conclusions we come to. It's that God, the universe and things in general, I think it kind of shows that analytics in some ways are a little bit ideological, right? The universe itself almost doesn't operate within the whims of a sort of logical coherence, right? And I think that's same with I think quantum physics are sort of kind of really, I think, honing into that. I think even something like the what is it? That if something can be thought to happen, it will happen. What's that called? Something, do you know? I'm missing the term for it. I'm sure someone will know exactly what I'm talking about. But essentially, if something can be thought to happen, or can technically happen, it will happen in the universe. That's something law.
Or in some given, is this sort of touching on multiverse?
Kind of, yeah. It's I can't remember. Anyways, I don't want to get hung up on the actual technicalities of the name of that, but I think a lot of these things are sort of counterintuitive to the very core way in which we almost scientifically sort of interact and logically interact cognitively. And I think it just, I think one of the interesting things of Fermi Paradox, I think that you can kind of really point to, that it shows, is that the origin, the metaphysical realm in which we exist is very chaotic, and it's very still not understood. And I think Fermi Paradox is one of the simplest ways to sort of kind of hint or point at that.
Yeah, and I should also note that Fermi doesn't really suggest a solution to this.
Right. Yeah.
This problem. He doesn't really say, but this question of where is everybody? One possible explanation is that they've simply destroyed themselves. Mm-hmm. Once you reach a certain level of development, you just wipe out the whole planet, because people can't be trusted with that kind of technology.
Right.
They end up killing everybody.
So I think
that's
that
sort of. I was just going to say I like that you touched on Zizek, because Zizek talks about sort of the problem or the danger of hope. He says that we need to sort of acknowledge the possibility that the light at the end of the tunnel is another train coming at you. And I really like that sort of ethos of, I think just from my own personal experiences, and this is anecdotal, as someone who has socialist inclinations, a lot of what I'm saying is kind of like, it can be construed as anti-socialist or sort of doomer or pessimistic or whatever. But I think we all need to sort of acknowledge that these things are very real. Like the possibility that humans are not going to make it to 2100. I think that's a very real possibility that we need to acknowledge. And so the question then becomes, what do we do?
Right.
What do we do once we accept this premise?
Exactly. I also think Zizek is correct. He's also talked about, and we don't think like this. Like, I think a lot of Marxists today, there's something changing within sort of like contemporary Marxism, is that it isn't positive in its approach. Like Marxism, at least in its core sort of theory, especially among like the positive inlook of dialectics, it's that the process of struggle, class struggle, it will always end up with the working class or the proletariat sort of rupturing from this dilemma and ending up on top until the next revolution occurs. And that's a very clear signal of positive dialectics, or a movement going forward, and of like actual progress. I think even someone like Adorno and negative dialectics, I think Zizek kind of hints at this. He's like, we should almost abandon, we really ought to abandon the idea of a pure positive class sort of Marxist approach, which that being of like core progress going everywhere. And if we look at it, especially, I think we still underestimate the impact of the neoliberal revolution. That is a clear example of negative dialectics. I even think I agree with Adorno in the dialectic of enlightenment. Fascism is a clear idea of negative dialectics, of regression, right? And the progress of the universe. And I think Zizek's, again, one of the only few public intellectuals that actually takes that he puts this in a theoretical terminology that gives a lot of context to like what we're experiencing. And I agree with his take that we ought to abandon the overly positive Marxist notion of raw progression, and even Hegelian notion at that.
The idea of history as a sort of series of gradually advanced epochs, right?
Correct. Yeah.
A sort of teleological understanding of history.
Mm-hmm.
I certainly think we should not view communism as inevitable. That is a very dangerous idea. That and it's almost kind of religious, right?
It 100% is religious. And that's one of my biggest problems with it, in my mind.
Yeah. Basically, the promised land is inevitable, and you're going to be saved as long as you accept our Lord Karl Marx into your heart.
Yeah, and
it's just Christian. It's Christianity, right?
Well, exactly. And I think that's sort of, and ironically, this is why in my mind, Marx would be fucking terrified at like a lot of I think a lot of the I want to say the Leninist trajectory of Marxism. Not to say that like you get into really weird lingual problems here, where it's harder to define what you mean by the problem with Leninism. Leninism itself is like not. Like, I think Lenin was a genius and absolutely correct on so many things. But the problem with the effect of what Leninism had on like actual core existing socialism is it created a sort of foundational like worship apparatus. And Marx critiqued the young Hegelians, including like Feuerbach, of having this sort of weird worship sort of apparatus. Like Marx talked explicitly about how like an almost fetishized notion of things is a really big issue. And even at the end of his life, when Marxists were starting to become like an actual concrete thing, Marx was like, these people are fucking insane. Like, this isn't, no. They're getting what I'm saying wrong. And it's that a lot of contemporary, I want to say existing orthodox Marxism is a very religious apparatus at the core of it, I think.
Well, I believe Marx is famous for saying, "I am not a Marxist."
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But that was in response to a very specific situation where he was responding to the idea that basically, if we advocate for basic social democratic reforms and those fail, it will show the working class that reform is actually not possible under capitalism, and that they will take it upon themselves to sort of stage the revolution at that point. Marx was responding to that idea, which is sort of a condescending way to view the working class. Basically saying that there's this group of people, and if we plan to have these sort of social democratic reforms, we can demonstrate to the working class that it's actually not possible to reform capitalism. He was responding, I believe that line of thought has a name. I can't remember what it is.
Right. And there's even a lot of like misunderstandings, right, of the sort of Leninist notion of reform versus revolution. And I think the binary of reform versus revolution really is not clearly articulated as well as it should be today. Even Lenin himself said that, yeah, like we ought to partake in sort of bourgeois democracy when we can, but not to essentially like rely on it. Essentially, like, and it has to be in tandem with organization and revolution itself. But nonetheless, that yeah, there's a sort of simulacrum of what Marxism is, and I think that almost exists with almost all ideologies. There is no concrete way to get people to sort of cling to things, right? Like ideology itself is something radically almost untouchable. And again, hearkening back, everything's coming back to Zizek. Zizek talks about this so much, where it's like the clear sort of Lacanian nature of ideology. And I really like this. I think ideology is so well given to someone like Lacan that like it's deeply symbolic, and it's also on the whims of the imaginary, which the imaginary is also something deeply like almost subjectively individual, right? It resists the sort of real, the real truth of things. And to Lacan, that's a little bit different than how Zizek uses it, but nonetheless, yeah, there's issues with how we approach these sort of problems, and yeah, Marxism has sort of stood to be a very big fetish.
And that, that is really inevitable. The idea that there is some pure form of Marxism out there, and there are all these distortions present in contemporary society. There is no pure Marxism, right? There is only all of these differing interpretations, and some interpretations, in my view, are more equipped as a mode of analysis for understanding the world, and some forms are more equipped for making people in oppressed situations feel like they're good people. And that's where you touch on ideology in the Zizekian sense, is sort of like this idea that we're all at our core just kind of responding to the void of life, and everyone is sort of coping with that. And the way in which we sort of rationalize the way things should be, or the way we want things to be, that's ideology,
right?
You know, it's a form of cope, to put it simply, right?
No, that's exactly it. And at least when we're looking at sort of like, especially hearkening back to disaster politics and a sort of future of simulation theory, I think there is a sort of phenomenon where I think psychoanalysis, right, especially the psychoanalysis that Zizek really holds to. It's that there is a sort of, and again, Zizek will say, he's like, things happen in the universe that resist the clear sort of pattern-like phenomenon that as Western liberals we like to think in, right? Like we are so positivistic of so many things, and at any point it seems to just like completely break apart. And I think in many ways, even the sort of, the simulation theory, especially along the lines of someone like Elon Musk, it is a very positivistic notion.
Yeah. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the representation of the simulation theory that we see largely on the internet is very positivistic, basically exploring this sort of science fiction-y idea. It's a form of, I think it's fair to say it's a form of escapism, at least in the way in which it's largely presented to people. Because, again, every single video I've watched really underestimates the possibility that we'll blow ourselves up or, boil this planet before we actually get to that point. They don't touch on that because I suppose it's not good for clicks, right? It's kind of a doomer idea, and people, I guess that demographic doesn't like to hear that sort of thing.
Yeah, and it's like you even discussed another in the video of yours, the sort of psychological phenomenon that I don't exactly know the name of, but it's that things like this, like complete destitution, are so unfathomable that we can't even, like, we cope with the idea that, oh no, we'll have the technology to deal with this, we'll have all of these things, and those aren't like that's not a scientific conclusion to come to, right? I can't remember what the terminology of that was. Do you know what I'm talking about? In your video you referenced the sort of psychological cope of like saying, oh, like, of this, we will handle this, like climate change within 30 to 40 years will look different because our technological growth in 30 to 40 years will look different.
Yeah, I don't know if there's a specific term for it. Confirmation bias would be certainly involved there. People want to believe that a better future is inevitable, and so they look to they basically, people interpret things in such a way that it supports their narrative, right? That the thing that they want to believe. So that's just confirmation bias, and everybody's guilty of that. But yeah, I don't know. It's
except Marxists, they're not.
Well, yeah, it depends on who you talk about.
Exactly, 100%. Yeah.
Right, because there are people who call themselves Marxists who believe that communism is inevitable. There are people who believe that I don't know, for instance, China is going to achieve some kind of supremacy and enable the conditions that lead to communism, which that's insane. So I don't know, confirmation bias is present within all sorts of different realms and ideologies.
Yeah, and I suppose I can kind of lead into this. We briefly talked about the educational system, right, and its apparent flaws. And I think one of the biggest flaws in my mind is, at least I get this idea that like there is a massive lack of like concrete, like people even grasping with critical thinking. Like it's like almost it doesn't exist. I actually see this with like debate students, oddly enough. Like a lot of debate students or like debate people who are in a debate, they will like clearly propose a sort of idea or thing, and it's very logically incoherent, right? And I'm not even I'm not a logicist or however you describe that. I'm not like into the analytical realm of philosophy, but I do think that these core foundations of thought, like understanding some logical fallacies and stuff like that, are still pretty important as to guide sort of your thinking in a way. I think it's still good to be grounded in those things, even if they're, analytics itself is still, a relatively ideological construct, and it has flaws. But I find like the education, the way we siphon through thought is so radically not good enough is the best way to put it. That like I almost think we ought to look at like thought processes, logical fallacies, and critical thinking as we do like the importance of literacy and mathematical sort of like functioning, right, for everyday people in the world.
Sure. Yeah. I would agree with that. I find it very comforting when I'm working on my sort of web development stuff and I have my program open and there's a logical problem in front of me, and I know for a fact that it is solvable. And even if it takes me a couple hours, I will get this thing to work because I can figure out the logical solution here. The problem with logic is that it can't give you it can tell you that these premises lead to this conclusion. Mm-hmm. It can't tell you what we should do.
Right. I think along the lines of the discussion of ideology itself and the sort of conclusions that a lot of people come to regarding things like China, for example, and stuff like that. I think there's just a clear lack of really foundational logic in how they approach a lot of potential questions. And I think even things like, hearkening to like climate change, the disaster, stuff like that. It's just, I can't help but almost see a problem that is radically individualistic with how we approach thought and how to cognitively sort of work through these problems. I don't know. We were just talking about the education system before, and I always, before this podcast started, and I always have thought it seems to become more of a relevant thought in my mind that like, fuck, the one thing we ought to really put emphasis on is a sort of structural way from a very young age, I'm talking like elementary school, should be taught like how to functionally think in a little bit more of a scientific, logical manner.
Yeah. Another thing to keep in mind, especially on social media, is that when you see somebody who is not making a logically coherent point, mm-hmm. That might be intentional. In other words, they might be thinking purely from an optics mm-hmm. Standpoint. So their demographic might not be people who are trained logicians. Their demographic is your average person,
right?
And so appealing to your average person doesn't always entail appealing to them on logical grounds, right?
Correct. I do find such a big issue with sort of, I find that to be like some of the worst optics that you can choose to do. I find that among like, that's a very social media problem, right? To like give an example or sorry, to like, when people on Twitter will like try to give an example that is clearly not like logically coherent whatsoever, as to try to defend their point or rhetorically sort of solidify the point they're trying to make. I just find that to be, because there's going to be people, I don't think people are as stupid as what other people think, or they're not as accepting. I find people to be very skeptical. Even the most mundane of people are very skeptical. And I think a lot of people in their gut can recognize sort of a very large logical error. I think even from a rhetorical standpoint, we ought to be more careful with how we approach our language. But that's, that's me.
No, yeah, definitely. I don't think that I would not advocate for that approach. Sure. I don't think that approach will even necessarily give you successful results. Maybe it does in certain contexts, But I think most people, I think mammals have evolved to detect when people are deceptive.
I think so too. Yeah.
So I think we all have our little bullshit detectors, and some people are more gullible than others. But I think for most people, we can detect when someone is not on the level, right?
Right.
I think that's why Hillary Clinton was so unpopular, is because she's so full of shit, right?
100%. I find I find one of the most arrogant I find the most arrogant notion in the world of the idea of mass populations being sheep. I don't think mass populations, especially Western liberals, people who are sort of, we are ingrained to think individualistically and stuff. The last thing we are sheep. We are radically skeptical people. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter if your skepticism is logically coherent. We are absolutely not sheep. And I think it is one of the most arrogant things that I see a lot of people think. They're like, oh, we need to get like mass media away from people because they're just going to believe whatever they say. No. And I think people like Zizek point this out very clearly. No. That's not how people think. We think in terms of rebellion often with things like mass media, right? We know they're bullshitting things like Hillary Clinton. People don't just believe these things, right? People will go on online crusades about how horrible Hillary Clinton is, and she is fucking horrible. And they think they're actually doing something, right? They think they're actually, they're escaping their sheepism, and it's actually not. It's not the case. If anything, you are solidifying the exact notion that humans are very radically skeptical.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there are all sorts of different demographics that are, of people who aren't fans of Hillary Clinton, right? Some of them are Trump supporters, which obviously it's like, you think Hillary Clinton is full of shit, but Donald Trump isn't,
right?
Well, that's pretty rich, So for that group of people, I would just say apply that sort of skepticism to the people that you support. Apply that same scrutiny to the people that you support. And by the way, I've done this. I'm critical of Bernie Sanders. I'm critical of AOC and the fucking squad, dude.
Yeah.
Fucking sellouts, dude.
Yeah.
No. Obviously I don't take the Jimmy Dore route, but I am skeptical of social democrats who I previously supported. I canvassed for Bernie Sanders. I campaigned for Bernie Sanders, but at the same time, I've come to the conclusion that I'm not sure that social democracy is possible at this stage of history. Specifically because of the declining rate of profit.
Right.
So ironically, like, conservatives are basically right when they say that there's no money for a robust welfare state. If you subscribe to the idea that there is a declining rate of profit, which is a basic Marxist precept, that is supported by some data. I'm not going to say it's like 100% fact, but it seems to be supported by the data. Then we need to figure out what the fuck to do as socialists. If social democracy is not viable, then that means revolution is the only other possibility. The only other viable possibility. But then the question is, what does revolution look like in 2021?
Exactly. I think that's, this is kind of a decent little thing to end off of, but I think that's in many ways right. Except I have sort of, when I look at like, right, when people say that social democracy is probably not possible, at least anywhere near the same sense as, historically speaking, I'm actually very much inclined to agree. I think, and then depending on who is saying this, a lot of the times the argument is that the centralized, foundational, real existing, quote unquote, socialism of the past, I don't even think that's possible anymore. But sometimes that'll be the alternate. It's like, no, social democracy isn't possible for X and Y reasons that are actually correct. Thus, we need to go back to something like the existing socialism of the past. I don't think we are in a very weird territory where I don't even know what economic system is necessarily possible. I've had some ideas. I think
I'm one of these infantile ultra leftists who say that this so-called actually existing socialism of the past was not socialism.
Same.
It was state capitalism. So I would not. I don't know if that's a good route.
Right. Well, and even too, there's Leninist arguments for this too. Some of the most potent Lenin gave a speech, and this seems to be really ignored. And I think even focusing to, people will argue all the time online between actual core Leninists and, the ultra lefties, and they'll be like, well, it wasn't actual socialism. I find even spending too much time on that to be quite stupid. But Lenin, and I find this to be very potent, at the beginning, he gave some speeches at the beginning of the sort of foundation of the USSR. And he said explicitly, I don't know if this is verbatim word by word, but like, don't get this wrong. We are not a socialist state. We can't be a socialist state. Yeah, we can't be a socialist state without a sort of international, much more international sort of approach that we have now. If anything, he said he underestimated, or the original Marxist notion of socialism being the gateway to communism is a little bit too simple. Rather, he thinks that the USSR is in the process of becoming socialistic. And so I think that's actually the right approach. Yeah. Is it existing socialism? Not really. I think according to almost every Marxist definition, not really. And it's not, even if it doesn't abide by, the core Marxist definition, that doesn't mean this existing socialism was some evil fucking entity or anything, But nonetheless, I think that's correct. And I think in today's world, I'm curious maybe to what you think. I think some of the most likely scenarios that I see is that capitalism as we know it is going to have to, I'm at least this sure, capitalism as we know it right now, or at least the sort of neoliberal foundations of capitalism that we are living in, it's going to have to end, and it will end. What will come from that, I'm not exactly sure. I think we will probably see a very weird quasi-democratic socialism, I think, that we've never seen. I have a feeling that, and it's not going to be abrupt, it's not going to be revolutionary, I don't think. I think we might have to live in a barbaric realm of necessity regarding the scarcity of stuff, especially regarding climate change, where I think UBIs will be the thing of the future. I think a lot of like housing will likely have to be assigned, and the over commodification will have to be sort of reeled in, and I think, but a lot of that's going to have to come from an actual core material necessity, not out of sort of the desire or revolutionary fervor of a socialistic future.
Right. Well, Marx said, what's the quote? Communism is basically the undoing of what is the actually existing present. So like in my mind, we have several possibilities here, right? Like, what you're suggesting is one, that this sort of quasi social democratic, possibility, or democratic socialism. Not to be, you don't want to confuse those two.
Sure.
But, the other possibility is some kind of hellish neo-feudalism, which to me seems more possible at this stage.
I think that,
it seems more likely to say. But then there's also, of course, bombing ourselves back to the Stone Age with, we'll have anarcho-primitivism. So maybe some of those people will get their way.
That's right, man. No, I think it's definitely between I think you're right, a sort of weird neo-feudalism, and I want to say, again, the approach, I want to say almost, the best way to describe it, probably the closest, is a democratic socialism. But then again, I don't know. We don't know these things, but I think what we can at least know is that neoliberal capitalism, or the foundational capitalism that we are living in today, is not possible. Like you said, I think there's one thing that's true. I'm not an economist. This is one area that I know very little about compared to other fields. But the idea of the theory of rate of profit and its decline within capitalism seems to be pretty correct. Whether or not like we're going to deal with the sort of monetize scarcity. You know, like I know MMT, modern monetary theory, has some other ideas. Whether or not one of these things are more correct, I'm not entirely sure. But the rate of profit falling within capitalism and the inability to reinvest into the economy, that seems pretty clear to me. I'm a little bit of a Marxist in that regard, but I don't know. I don't know the future. Yeah, I think the future is. I kind of hold the position that it's bleak, but there might be some glimmers of hope in between.
Yeah, and we have to recognize opportunities when they present themselves, because yes, radical change isn't always possible, but there are moments in history when you are presented with an opportunity. And so the wisdom comes from being able to recognize that and seizing that opportunity. I think at the onset of this pandemic, socialists were presented with an opportunity to basically spell out the necessity of the working class in order to, keep society functional. And I did see some pretty good messaging on that front. Mm-hmm. I don't know if everybody was on the same page about everything, but, history presents you with opportunities. And I don't want to be a complete doomer. I know a lot of what we've talked about has been kind of glib. Mm-hmm. And, I guess my basic attitude is rooted in a sort of disappointment with electoral politics, and touching on Zizek and the sort of danger of hope. I think one common reaction when you have been so disappointed by something that you put your heart into. So a lot of people, I think that's true of a lot of people who supported Bernie Sanders. A very common reaction is to just be like, well, fuck it all. Fuck everything, man. This is like, there's no hope. And I don't think that's true either. I think we need to be realistic about the challenges in front of us, and be strategic, be able to recognize opportunities when they present themselves.
I think that's right. 100%. I think we're roughly, I think we went well over the hour mark, maybe. I don't know. This is a very good conversation, but I think that's also kind of a decent place to leave off of. We talked about the sort of weird origins of simulation theory, Nick Bostrom, into the sort of ideological underpinnings of it, to the sort of Marxist interpretations of the future. So that was quite a podcast episode, dude. That was a lot of fun, though. I appreciate you coming on. Yeah.
Sure. Thanks. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. But no, dude, I'd love to have you on again. No, genuinely, that was we covered a lot of ground there. It was wonderful. It was actually a better podcast than when you're talking about simulation theory, it can, it's kind of, and you did such a good job of laying it out. So I didn't even know how much ground we'd be able to cover. We covered a lot. So that was absolutely wonderful. It was awesome.
Yeah, I know when you're talking about logical argumentation, it can get a little dry. So I kind of just try to cut to the chase and really simplify it.
Right. And I think you did a good job. So, to anyone listening, if you're still here, thank you for 1. 2, go check out the video. I actually found it to be, I actually really quite enjoyed it. I think you were able to siphon through a lot of stuff. It was clear, concise, while also not being really muddled down whatsoever. It was really quite enjoyable. And there's not a lot of good discussion over simulation theory, I suppose. A lot of it is kind of really weird, fetishized, like fucking pop science, I guess is the best way to describe it. But yeah, it was a very good video.
Definitely. Thank you.
Yeah. So, all right. Thank you again for coming on. Yeah. Thanks, dude.
All right, man. Take care.